Welcome to The Criminlogist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. This week, bringing you a special American Probation and Parole Association edition. As the voice of the community corrections industry, APPA serves as the field's leading professional membership association. In addition to their U.S. members, the American Probation and Parole Association is supported by international members who are actively involved in strengthening community corrections work in their own countries. APPA's International Relations Committee aims to connect community corrections professionals around the world to inspire and share insights from their unique experiences and best practices. Welcome to this special APPA episode of The Criminlogist. And now, welcome your host, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 142 of the Criminlogist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. This week, we are bringing you yet another special hybrid edition as we are teaming up with our good friends at the American Probation and Parole Association, APPA. We hope to weave in more and more of these special edition episodes in the future, so stay tuned in particular for those. Or, if you are a first-time APPA listener, I encourage you to go back and catch up on all of our previous APPA collaborations or any of our episodes from our catalog of amazing installments for that matter. For those of you who may not be aware of the American Probation and Parole Association, let me bring you some brief contextual information before I share my conversation with this week's very special guest. The American Probation and Parole Association really is the voice of the community corrections industry. APPA serves as the field's leading professional membership association. Their work is supported by thousands of passionate members throughout the United States and Canada, as well as other countries actively involved in strengthening community corrections work. Now, APPA has members at all levels of the government and the private sector, including community corrections professionals, service providers, libraries and educators, research students, volunteers, concerned citizens, corporations, public policy advisors, and others with an interest in criminal justice and juvenile justice. Everything that APPA does is aimed at reducing recidivism to keep our communities safe. That means strengthening the role of the community corrections industry. Prior to the founding of APPA, community corrections professionals had no collective voice. Having no national representation fighting for best practices and policies in our field inspired some of America's most distinguished correctional administrators to act. Now, they accomplished this goal in a variety of ways. In the field, they produce Perspectives magazine, community corrections headlines, they publish research reports, guides, put on webinars, and other web-based products and services. For the professional, they offer their training institutes, their leadership institutes, they have on-site training as well as online training. And as far as best practices, APPA is all about advocating for evidence-based practices and policies in the field. They organize committees, they host issue-specific working groups, and of course, lead focus groups. Now, who better to highlight the great work of APPA than their current executive director, Veronica Cunningham? Veronica is about to share with you all her amazing career highlights, but let me just touch on some of those just by way of introduction. As noted, Veronica Cunningham is currently the executive director of the American Probation and Parole Association. Some of her previous titles included Director of Pretrial Services for the Vera Institute of Justice. She was formerly the chief for Cook County Adult Probation and Director for the Texas Department of Corrections Parole Division. Prior to that, she served as probation and parole officer for the Louisiana Department of Public Safety. I am so thrilled to be bringing you this conversation with Veronica Cunningham. Please enjoy, and I will see you all on the other side. Well, welcome to the show, Veronica. Thank you so much for being a part of this special American and Probation and Parole Association edition of the Criminlogist podcast, in which we try to shine a light on some of the great work that APPA does, not just here in America or North America, but around the world, actually. Why don't we start out by, you can introduce yourself to the audience. Tell us a little bit about yourself in terms of your perhaps educational and vocational milestones, and then we'll do a deeper dive on some of these great topics.
So, Joe, thank you so much for having me. I really, really appreciate it. And I'm always happy to talk about APPA and certainly about the field of community corrections. So I didn't start out to end up in this field, but I did. And I'm glad I did, because I feel like I've added some level of value to the work we do, not just in a small way within those organizations I worked in, but, across the board. I actually did my internship at the Sheriff's Department in my hometown of New Orleans. It was short-lived. I realized that wasn't a part of the justice system that I wanted to work in. It was hard listening to those bars and doors closed all the time. And it was tough just seeing the people come in after they'd been arrested. So I quickly moved to work in community corrections in New Orleans, or in Louisiana, I should say. Probation and parole are combined. So I started as a probation and parole officer in New Orleans, worked for a couple of years, got married, moved to the state of Texas, and spent my entire time, almost 18 years in Texas, working in the parole system for the state. Started out as a field officer, worked my way up to head that department of about 2,400 employees, about a $200 million budget. After some period of time, Chicago, Cook County came calling, and I moved to Chicago and headed the probation system here in Cook County in Chicago and the surrounding areas. And then, I decided I was getting old, so I thought I was retiring. But that didn't happen, because then Vera Institute of Justice came calling, and I did a little work for Vera in their demonstration project on pretrial back in my hometown in New Orleans. But it was, a fairly brief project. And then I moved on to where I am today, and that's at APPA. And I've been here over 6 years now. So super excited. Again, not as a practitioner, but to stay connected to the field has been wonderful for me.
I am a member of APPA. I attend the workshops and institutes. I've presented at conferences. Veronica, maybe talk about one of your proudest moments serving as executive producer of APPA, or maybe highlight an initiative that really resonated with you.
Oh, my goodness. I will say to you that being a small organization, I am really surprised on some level, but absolutely so pleased with the progress that we've been making over the last several years. And of course, I can't take credit for any of it by myself. It's, no man is an island. So I have a great and mighty small group of individuals who work side by side with me. So I give them all of the credit. I even have one who's been with APPA for almost 24 years, who really has the institutional knowledge, and she's been an absolutely fantastic asset. There are a couple of things that I'm supremely proud of, and I think one of them probably is, and this required a lot of work, but I think it's really walking into the organization and doing an assessment of where we were at that time and where I wanted to take the organization. Now, we're still not quite there, but I think we've made a lot of progress in that regard. And I think one of the biggest parts for me was really looking at the organizations from a stability standpoint, looking at our operational model, looking at our financial or fiscal health, if you will. And everybody does things differently, and I certainly will never say anything about how anybody else operated. But when I walked in, the organization was challenged a little bit from a financial standpoint. And so one of my goals was to really bring a lot more focus to our financial health, a lot more integrity to the processes involved in managing finances for an organization. And that meant really focusing on all of the assets of the organization, the tangible assets such as the equipment and obviously the money, but also the intangible assets such as the staff. I feel like coming in, the staff were a little bit of, they were concerned, obviously, because the person before me had been there for a long time, so they didn't know what to expect. But I am certainly one of those who really believes in embracing the staff and including them in as much of the decision making that I can. And so we did that. So my goal on this financial piece, and the reason I'm so proud of it, is we have increased our financial reserves, if you will, by 400% in the time that I've been here. And so I couldn't be more proud about that. And like I said, I didn't do it alone. I had a lot of support, primarily from the staff. But of course, we have some great board members that we look to get ideas and suggestions from, and all of the people who support APPA, our members and partners, because our revenue stream is primarily our training institutes and our membership base. So that's kind of helped us. So it's really important for me to continue along that journey, because I think it's important for us to have something to fall back on if we end up in another calamity like we did with COVID, impacting the organization and everybody in the world, if you will, for almost 2 years, and want to have something to stick and stay. I think another really, really proud thing for me is one of the things that I know APPA is widely known for is its training institutes. An opportunity for people to come together to develop themselves, whether they pay for it out of their own pockets or whether their organizations support them in doing that. But those training institutes, I think, are really kind of a status for APPA. And I really, really wanted to elevate them, if you will. So one thought to elevate them was to bring in the types of speakers that I believe people would be interested in hearing. And so over the last few years in particular, I've tried to really identify some individuals who I thought their message would bring value to the conversation we would be having around the field of community corrections. One of the first persons that I brought in 2019 in San Francisco was Van Jones. Everybody knows Van Jones, CNN commentator, lawyer by trade. He's doing a lot of work on justice system reform, works in a lot of not-for-profits, best-selling author, and the list goes on. And he really, really talked about the need for reform and talked about the important role that he understands community corrections professionals can play in that. Another that I was super excited about, of course, was Brian Stevenson, who you probably saw in Atlanta. Oh, my gosh. When we talk about a man who is so soft-spoken, yet so poignant with his message, who really can speak to difficult topics such as racial injustice or racial inequality and not really piss people off. He really, you hold on to every word he says because you believe him. He's honest. He has a great deal of integrity. And I was so taken by, I've been trying to get him for years. And when he finally said yes, you would have thought I was a kid in a candy store. So I was happy to see him. And then lastly, of course, we brought the folks from Ukraine to Chicago this summer. And for those brave people with what they're going through in their home country to take time out of their schedules, the Deputy Minister of Justice and the Head of Probation Services, to come to Chicago to talk to us about their work prior to the war and now what the challenges are during this time. It was just absolutely amazing to me. And one of the things I've committed to them, whether it's through APPA or me as an individual, when this war is over, several of us have committed ourselves to going to Ukraine to help them to rebuild their probation services. So those are just a couple of things that I'm supremely proud of.
As you should be. You said a few things there that I want to sort of unpack. Veronica, clearly your passion for management comes through when you talk about how you've approached that leadership role with APPA. And I know when you've talked about managing individuals before and agencies, you've made reference to the P4 philosophy, I guess, the P4 space: people, programs, projects, and processes. Can you maybe walk through that a little bit with the audience, and again, how you've applied that in your endeavors?
Yeah. So for me, and I came up with this years ago, and I was just kind of trying to look for something that not only rhymed, but made sense in terms of keys to organizational success. And I've used them my entire career at every place I've ever worked, and including APPA. So in terms of people, I mean, we all know that people are our greatest assets, right? So if you don't have good people, if you don't have happy people who are ready to come to work and do the organization's work, you have nothing. So, APPA, as I've spoken earlier, a primary part of what we do is our training institute. So we've revealed ourselves as an organization that really focuses on helping people in the field learn, right? And so coming into the organization, especially a small organization like this, I wasn't really sure how much staff development had taken place. And I learned that not a lot. So it was so critical for me to start getting the staff members the training they need, because if our mantra is to train the field, we needed to be trained too. So those staff members needed to be trained. So we did a lot of that. And I would say to you that I'm so proud of our training portfolio. We have a partnership with Relias, where we do on-site training, discounted training for members. We have a partnership with NCTI out of Arizona to do training out in the field. We have our webinars. Obviously, we have our training institutes. Those are huge. And so we also have customized training that we'll create for a probation or parole department. If you tell us what you need, we'll find a consultant who can come out and deliver that service for you. So that's the people part. You really have to develop your people, train them, make sure they have the correct skill sets to do the work. Our staff can't be an afterthought. We have to be, staff development has to be as important internally as it is externally for us. When I talk about, let's say, programs, programs are the mantra for APPA. Programs are the mantra for community corrections. Every single thing we do in the field should be purposeful, number one, and should be around programs that pass the test. We have to ask ourselves every single day, is it going to improve the outcomes of the people under supervision? So in APPA, we have to think about the things we're delivering to our members and stakeholders, whether or not that's going to be of value to them in their professions. When I think about projects, again, it's just like projects keep us on our toes. Coming into the organization, I remember one of the first meetings I had with the staff was around the training institute, since I knew that was such a large part of the organization. And people had notes of we do this and we do that, but it wasn't very organized, if you will. So we needed to streamline that process, and we came up with something we now call our Training Institute Guide. So we have all of our projects related to training institutes and all of the other things we do mapped out, because I think SOPs or standard operating procedures or simplification, work simplification guidelines, whatever you call them, you have to have something in place so that if someone wins the lottery today and leaves APPA because we are such a small organization, the good news is, as long as you can read, if it's not a technical job like graphics designing or computers, you can do this work for APPA and we can keep the ball rolling. And lastly, I would say in terms of processes, I don't think most of us think about it much, but processes are really a part of every aspect of our lives. We have to be 100% on top of our game as an industry when we're developing the steps we need to improve the lives of those individuals that we supervise. So that's always been a part of my keeping people focused on what we need to deliver as an organization and those things that we need to have in place so that we can be successful. And that holds true for both APPA and the field.
I just love that holistic approach, as you said, looking at those things ranging from people, programs, projects, and processes. I think too often agencies or departments get hyper-focused on one, but they're just not seeing the big picture. And we, or certainly I, have seen the dividends of that just in what, just in what you've done with APPA, in particular the Training Institute. I think when most folks think of APPA, the training institutes come to mind. Maybe they're the most visible. But again, I love how you've advanced that from the traditional approach, and maybe we should talk about that. I know we're coming off a wildly successful APPA Training Institute in Chicago, but in the winter, tell us about the different approach APPA is taking with the various winter training institutes spread out over various venues and locations.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to talk about that. I'm super excited about it. Of course, it's requiring a lot of work. Again, with a small group, it's like instead of planning one training institute for the winter, we're simultaneously planning 5. So we're literally we've had to create 5 different sites, and the list goes on. So we had of course, we typically have one in the winter and one in the summer. But I guess about a year or so ago, we realized that we had an empty space. We hadn't contracted with the hotel per se for this winter 2023. And we've been tossing this around for a little bit, like, okay, and even having conversations with our board. Should we continue to have 2 training institutes, or should we pivot to one? And maybe during that off season, we could have either just a virtual training institute, or we could have maybe regional training institutes. So I thought about it and talked to the board members about this. I said, you know what? We get so many calls particularly from directors and agency heads from small to medium-sized departments that says, look, I can never send a representative amount of people to your large conferences. So if I'm based in a small county in Arizona, the chances of me being able to send more than 1 or 2 people to New York or to San Francisco or someplace like that is really slim to none. So they've asked for it, so we're bringing it to them. So they want conferences or training institutes, I should say, that are closer to home for them. So APPA, by its model and structure, we're divided into 5 regions. So we're going to have a meeting in each of those regions. We're going to start actually next month. We're going to start our first regional meeting in Columbus, Ohio, January 23rd through the 25th. They're a scaled down version of our training institute, so 1 full day less than we would normally have for a regular training institute. But that's going to probably be, I would say, one of the most well-attended ones. And that's interesting. So for winter, we typically would have somewhere on the low end 600 people, on the high end 1,000. We expect to touch substantially more than 1,000 with these 5. So that's a good news, right? So Columbus alone, we're probably going to get close to 500 to 600 attendees in Columbus. We're already well over 400, and we still have a whole month to go. So that's going to be Columbus. Then we're going to move on to my hometown, to New Orleans. And everybody loves going to New Orleans. So New Orleans dates from January 29th through the 31st. So we'll be in New Orleans, and just an amazing program. One of the things I ask all of our volunteer program organizers to do is, if possible, embed some conversation around health, wellness, and safety. I think the conversation that's going to take place in New Orleans is going to blow people out of the water. Again, it's going to be a very frank and honest conversation about what agencies are doing or not doing in that space, as well as how individuals are taking care of themselves from a health and wellness perspective. And it's going to be led by Dr. Greg Dillon. He's out of one of the probation departments in Texas, right outside of Houston in Brazoria County. So Dr. Dillon is going to lead the roundtable on that discussion. And I'm super, super excited. And I'm also excited that coming to New Orleans, and he's been with us a few times before, but he's such a great friend of APPA. People love hearing his story. We're going to have Chef Jeff Henderson, who you probably know he started down the wrong path, young man selling drugs, incarcerated. Out of that came a love for cooking after working in the kitchen. And now he's been on television. He's written best-selling books, et cetera. So he's going to be our opening speaker in New Orleans. So we're super excited about that. From New Orleans, we'll move over to Omaha, Nebraska. And one of our awesome board members, Gene Cotter, is leading that program there. And super, super excited about what Gene is doing. So many different things that he's going to throw into the mix in Omaha. That meeting is February 5th through the 7th. And so super excited about that. And then we'll go on to Philadelphia. Now, there's good news and bad news about Philadelphia. The good news is I love that city. I love going to Philadelphia, right, because of all of its, historical parts of what that city and state has to offer. The bad news is, from some accounts, not mine, we're going to kick off on Super Bowl Sunday. So we're kicking off on February 12th. and we end on Valentine's Day. But what we've done is we are going to start a lot earlier. We typically start our opening sessions at 5 o'clock, but we're going to start at 2. And we're going to have our opening session at 2, and then we're going to go right into the reception we normally have with our vendors and exhibitors. And then from there, we're going to have a big game party. We're going to turn that big room into a fun time. We're going to have games. We're going to have refreshments. And who wants to watch the football game on a 65-inch TV when they can watch it on I don't know how big the screens are, but they're huge, right? They're huge. So we're excited about Philadelphia and think we'll get a great turnout. Some people will make sure they'll, get out of the session in time to catch the pre-activities, but it's going to be all fine. And of course, we're going to end at noon. So, and since it's a regional meeting, anybody should be able to get home to their sweetheart well in time for Valentine's Day dinner. So we're excited about Philly. And last but certainly not least, Los Angeles, which I think, along with Columbus, will be one of our largest attendees. At that one, we will also have our Leadership Institute graduation, but that one is actually the 26th through the 28th of February. Again, super, super duper excited. One of the things that really stands out to me about the plans for Los Angeles, in addition to the Leadership Institute graduating there and the board having their meeting there as well, is they're going to kick off with a panel of people who work in the juvenile and justice systems right now, but also people who have spent time in adult and juvenile facilities. There's a young man who unfortunately went to prison as a juvenile, tried as an adult for murder. And to talk about where he is today is absolutely bananas in a great way. I mean, he's gone on to go to school. He is going to be released soon, I should say. And he's already been admitted into 5 universities. And he's all about giving back to the community. That's going to be exceptional. He's exceptional. He served his time in the facility there in Los Angeles proper. And then we'll also have a woman who she's in the state of California, but not in Los Angeles. She's going to talk about her time in prison and the work she's doing at a not-for-profit in the Sacramento area. And again, as I said, we'll have leaders and practitioners on that same panel. So that's no doubt going to be an exciting and robust conversation. So I'm excited about that. So there we have it for the winter. And then, of course, we go to the summer. Don't forget about the summer, Joe. We're going to be in New York City. Again, one of my favorite places. Also, the city that we typically have the largest number of attendees. We typically have anywhere from 2,000 to 2,400 people in New York. And if I've got anything to do with it, we're gonna beat that number substantially in the summer of 2023. And that meeting is the 27th of August through the 30th. Already beginning to line up some speakers for that and just kind of getting the show on the road so that we can deliver a super value added program to the people who attend.
The good news with offering a variety of venues, as you articulated, it gives the probation officer more options to attend. The bad news for someone like me who has, as my daughter calls it, FOMO, fear of missing out, is I can't decide which conference to attend. I was going to think about Omaha, because if I'm not mistaken, our dear friend Alex Walker is presenting at Omaha, part of her ACJI. Great work they do.
Well, Alex is presenting at 3 of them.
Well, because when you talked about Los Angeles, that was really appealing to me as well, in particular. And maybe Veronica, talk about you referenced it real briefly, the Leadership Institute graduation. I know a couple of individuals who met through that leadership training that APPA does, and I don't really think enough folks know what that's all about. Most of the boots on the ground line staff, I think they look at APPA and the institutes as a training opportunity, but maybe highlight and give a shout out to folks interested in attending the Leadership Institute.
Absolutely. Yeah, we are so proud of that part of what we offer. Mark Carey, who was a president of our board several years ago, this was his brainchild. He decided that, Of course, people like him who are at the top of their game as leaders and directors of probation, parole departments, et cetera, were pretty good. You can never stop learning, but they were in a good space. But those individuals who were emerging leaders, those individuals who the director would look at them and say, that person has the potential and the capacity to perhaps lead this organization at some point. So I want to invest some time and resources into him or her. Those are the individuals that we are focused on with the Leadership Institute. So this institute takes place over essentially an 18-month period. Individuals started this particular one in January in Atlanta. It was the first class. Typically, we don't have any more than 25 to 30 people in a class. I think we have 26 in this one. And again, they're certainly not people who are at the top layer of their organizations, but somewhere kind of in the middle. And actually, in some respects, we've even taken on a few occasions line staff, because these people come from really tiny organizations where there are really only 1 or 2 positions or 3 positions. So again, they get an opportunity to come to the class. We have some amazing volunteer coordinators to help us with that and create this awesome curriculum. We connect them to a mentor, someone who's in this space as a professional, has been doing this work for a long time. A lot of retired chiefs and directors are mentors for these young people. And so we take them through this full year. Of course, they met in Chicago. It was their second face-to-face meeting. But in the interim, they're doing some virtual meetings and classes as well. They're getting books they're assigned to read, et cetera. And then, of course, they will graduate from that Leadership Institute in Los Angeles, California, on the Monday that we're there for the Training Institute, which will be the 27th of February. And again, just super excited to allow them to go back to their organizations with a renewed sense of understanding and knowledge and able to take something back. And one of the wonderful things about it, their last project for the class, they actually have to create something that's going to add value to their department. So that organization can see firsthand how it spent its money to support this individual going to this, because they've taken an issue or initiative in that department and they created it from scratch or built on it to improve it for the organization as a whole. So super, super excited about that.
Yeah, I've got a couple of connections. Albert Banuelos over in Los Angeles, as well as Jason Marinas here in Minnesota, who are graduates. And they cannot say enough about that Leadership Institute. And of course, the two of them keep in touch. So it's a great way to build your social capital, as we would say, if you're in a corrections leadership position. Hey, Veronica, just now when you were speaking of the lineup in Los Angeles, you mentioned the young man with lived experience who's going to come and share his story. I just think that is such an underutilized resource that we are just learning to tap into in corrections. Regular listeners of this podcast will know that in addition to having subject matter experts such as yourself on the program, I also like to have on those with lived experiences who I often refer to as our true subject matter experts. Again, I think it's just such an untapped resource. And you even mentioned the desire to give back, which, not to get too wonky, but even in the desistance literature, they talk about desisted people having this feeling of generativity or wanting to give back as part of their process, part of that trajectory you're on. So yes, thank you, APPA, for shining a light on those with lived experience, because I think that's something that as a field we really historically, I think, have even shunned. If people even suggested, well, why don't we bring in an ex-client or someone who used to be on supervision? And sadly, the knee-jerk reaction historically has been, no. That's the last person we want to hear from, when ironically, those are the first people we want to hear from. So yes, thank you for that. And I hope I see more of that from APPA moving forward.
Yeah, you will. As a matter of fact, from when I first arrived, the first training institute had already been planned. That was in Atlanta, almost 7 years ago. But if you look at the record, if you will, I've included formerly incarcerated, lived experience people on just about every one of our training institutes. We had our racial justice town hall, for example, in Chicago, where we had people with lived experience on that. And it's important to hear their story. It's important to get the perspective of their perspective on what we do right, and what we need to improve on in our space. And that those are the people who are sitting across the table from probation and parole officers, and they're probably in a better position to some degree to tell us that, even more so sometimes than their leaders, because their leaders have probably never seen them interview someone on supervision. So yes, absolutely, they need to be a part of the conversations we're having about this work.
I know the field is in a really special place right now, because I think, to our credit, we're reflecting on what we've done, best practices, and really starting to even think outside that box of our traditional role. Our mutual friend, Brian Lovins, has talked a lot and even written a lot about how we are redefining the role of the probation officer, moving from, as he puts it, more of that role of referee, just calling penalties and throwing flags, to being one of coach. And I think that ties in with, again, our goal of reducing revocations. Where do you see that going in the future, again, with the idea of maybe changing the mindset even of that practitioner, of what your true role is of a change agent?
Yeah, you know what? We are in a place where I've said this to several people recently. If we don't get this right within the next 5 to 10 years, shame on us. Because we have so many people who are spending the time and money, and entities that are spending the money. When you think of organizations like Arnold, right? Arnold Ventures and Annie Casey Foundation and MacArthur and Pew, they are so invested in the work that we're doing here. If we don't take advantage of growing and of not just reforming, but transforming our organizations and our work to doing something really special so that we see more success stories, shame on us. I love Brian's analogy of being a coach as an officer. And I was sharing actually with him and a group in Santa Cruz, California, just last month. I was there. Brian and I were both there. They're part of Arnold's Reducing Revocation Challenge. And I'm one of the advisors, if you will, to that particular location where, again, the focus is on looking at internal processes, policies, and practices to determine why so many revocations on technical violations, right? So, and I was sharing with that group then, as well as with Brian, that there are so many wonderful technical and scientific things we can talk about as it relates to the work in the criminal justice system in general and community corrections more specifically. But I have always operated on the basis of, and it sounds kindergarten, but treating people the way I would want to be treated. I've always sat across from people who I says, boy, if that was my son or that was my brother, how would I want to handle this situation with him? And I remember I shared this with Brian that when I was a young officer, and I'm telling my age now, but when I was a young officer in 1983, I met a parole officer. His name is Randy Brigham. And it was amazing to me to hear Randy, who apparently was this big sports person, had played football all his life in college and so on and so forth. I would hear him talk to his clients and say things like, look, guys, we're going to get through this. We're going to get through it together. I'm going to help you. We're going to go get it. We're going to win, et cetera, et cetera. His clients referred to him as Coach Randy or Coach Brigham. And so many of us took up that same mantra. And so Brian's absolutely right in terms of reminding everybody, your job is not to find everything that's wrong with the person and shut them down or make them feel even worse about it. Your job is to lift them up, to rah, to coach, to be a cheerleader. I used to tease Randy all the time. So, Randy, I'm not going to be a coach, but I'm going to be a cheerleader to my clients. And so, yeah, I think we're in a space that we're having these conversations about what works and what doesn't work in terms of just the whole behavioral health piece that's so deeply embedded in the lives of the people that we serve. Having been an officer, of course, I sat across from people who never knew their parent or father. When you expect a person to be a Boy Scout, but he didn't have a role model, he didn't have anyone teaching him or her right from wrong, that's tough to do. And that was one client that I'll never forget. And unfortunately, I lost contact with him after about 20 years where he would send my parents to go to the home I lived in when I was an officer in New Orleans. He would send a Christmas card to my parents' house to me all that time. And then, of course, when Katrina happened, my parents left and so on and so forth. But this was a young man who was born in prison. His mother was a prostitute, gave birth to him on the shower floor in the prison. And the only person that could take him, other than to send him through the system, of course, was a relative in a wheelchair, an older lady in a wheelchair. And when I remember interviewing her, I remember it so vividly when she shared with me that everything was fine because even though she was in a wheelchair, she could do everything she needed to do. She just didn't have legs. The wheels were her legs. She took care of him. When he went to kindergarten, he already knew how his numbers, he knew his alphabets and so on and so forth. But they lived in low-income housing. So once it was time for him to go off to school, she had no more control, or she didn't have the level of control that she did prior to that. He got caught up in that space with other people who didn't have a guardian like him to teach him right from wrong and to set great examples for him. So I say all of that to say that a lot of the individuals under supervision who have technical violations, I don't think they're intentionally saying, I'm not going to do right. They don't know any better. They haven't had anybody to teach them the importance of being on time and going to an appointment on a scheduled time. And some of them are just afraid, especially if they don't have what they were expected to have, such as supervision fees and things like that. They just don't show. They're like, okay, they're going to put me in jail because I don't have the $50 I owe them. So, yeah, we're in a space that we're having these great conversations. We have to keep our eye on the prize that these are human beings just like we are. And there's such a thin line between where they are and where we are. And so I think we're going to start making some progress. And I will say the last thing I will say on this subject is, for me, it's important for APPA to have a much bigger role. We obviously can't lobby. We are a not-for-profit organization. But to have a much bigger role in identifying policies that negatively impact the individuals that we serve, right? So we need to be having those conversations with our legislators and policymakers about where we are in the justice system. Because as you know, Joe, community corrections is the least talked about sector of the justice system. We're the least funded sector of the justice system. That has to all change. It really has to.
How many of those reforms can start as well? I'm kind of going back to the international aspect that we kicked all this off with by maybe looking at some of our global partners and looking at some of their approaches or even those cultural things that we're just still stuck in maybe with corrections in the United States. I know it's sadly not uncommon. I talk to colleagues who attend APPA events and, we always come back so energized and ready to tackle the world. But then sadly, we get immersed in the current culture of our, not just our own agencies, but just sort of the state of affairs here. And it just gets to be a little frustrating. But I brought up the international aspects of this. Again, I've had the good fortune to train alongside and visit some of those jurisdictions. And it's just really inspiring, I guess, to look at some of what they're doing over there, particularly with those emerging desistance models, which are really strength-based. And maybe that's where it starts. We don't see our primary role as catching people doing something wrong, but rather affirming them doing something good. Might it take that type of different, I guess, recalibration of just what the job of the probation officer is? I think we kind of sometimes go through role identity confusion between, well, am I a change agent, a social worker, because I was just issued a bulletproof vest and a badge and pepper spray. So I think for the practitioner, it's difficult sometimes to figure out what the expectation is.
Yeah. Oh, I totally agree. And you know what? I recently had a conversation with someone around that whole example you just gave about carrying a weapon. And on some, there's a part of me that wants to say, oh, I wish they didn't carry weapons. And, you're right. People can misunderstand what their role can be. But on the other hand, every single thing we do, it's about how you read your purpose as an individual. So my start in my career, right, outside of the sheriff's department, my first job in probation parole, the folks in Louisiana, probation and parole officers, are commissioned peace officers. So I carried a weapon, but I will submit to you that the person I was, the probation and parole officer I was in Louisiana while carrying that weapon every single day was no different than the probation officer or parole officer I was when I didn't carry a weapon. And interestingly enough, this conversation comes up in some of those international conversations, right? You and I talk about that because I know you do a lot of work with our international partners. And I'm super excited that people like you are going to those countries and sharing the little bit of what we know here in the United States with them. And by the same token, I think you'll agree that we learn a lot from them as well, because, America is a huge country and a major player in all things. And so to go to those countries, as I went to Poland this past year, you get to learn so much that, I hadn't thought about that, or we haven't been doing that. Maybe we can do that too. Because again, no man is an island and we can all learn from each other. So I think it's great that we have an opportunity at APPA to have this International Relations Committee led by Julie Trishelle. I think she's done a fantastic job over the last several years. And Julie, actually, for your information, Julie she has her SAW project as now she's she just recently received not-for-profit status for her project. And I am so fortunate to be one of her board members. So I am thrilled at the work she is doing, how she's bringing attention to the need for us to work together, not just within the United States, but abroad.
Yeah, I'm aware of Julie's SAW project. It's awesome. And again, I love that it just goes towards increasing awareness that APPA and everything we're doing, it's a global initiative. I will continue to promote that SAW project. Anything else, Veronica, again, as far as what's going on to increase awareness of APPA and the important work, of those in the field of community corrections and supervision?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. So, it's so interesting. And just a couple of days ago, we had this same conversation, the same topic in our board meeting about increasing the awareness of not just APPA, but the field of community supervision. Because obviously, there's so many people who don't know the difference between probation, parole, don't know what a judge does versus what a parole board does, and the list goes on. So some years ago, I was a part of a committee put on by ACA, actually. And in that committee, our focus was really trying to figure out strategies and solutions to how we really add value to our organizations by making sure people understand the important work that's being done in our field. And that committee didn't last for a very long time. But, one of the things I shared with the board was I'm going to find my notes from that committee, and I'm going to dust them off. And those are some of the things that, as we're now moving at APPA into more of a focus on awareness. We just hired a new marketing communications director. We actually had never had one until earlier this year. We brought a young lady in, but she ended up leaving the organization to go back to education. The young woman who just came on board with us, she has some amazing skills and talents. So she and I are going to be working closely on creating a campaign of awareness for, again, not just APPA, but for the field. So that's important because, again, if we want people to know of the valuable work we do, they're just not going to learn it in a vacuum. Most people are not going to pick up a book or search on the internet about probation unless they're involved in the system or the family member. But the John Q. citizen is not. But I know when I share with my neighbors the work I do and why I do it, they have a totally different perspective because most of them think of, you work with the criminals or something awful like that, right? And then when they understand why we do it, who these people are, who the individuals are that come to us that need our support and assistance, they get it. And I've even gotten some of them to join APPA, even though they've never worked in the justice system a day in their lives. But this is my way of supporting the work you guys are doing. So yes, APPA is going to go all out on trying to build a campaign. There are about 100,000 probation and parole officers in our country, and somewhere 90 to 100. We never get the right number. I'm not sure what that is, but I believe that there's strength in numbers, and a large percentage of that 100,000 or whatever that number is, they're not members of APPA. So we have to do a much better job of showing them who we are, what value we add to the industry. And I will also say to you that I think most people are, again, they're just kind of trying to figure it out at work. And maybe they get involved in their local organizations, but they don't get involved in a larger organization. But the benefit of joining APPA, I would say, is because we're not like the local organization. So most of them have only volunteers. We run our organization like a business because we have to pay rent, we have to employ people, we have to pay insurance and all of those kinds of things. And so, again, there's strength in numbers. So the more people we get to join APPA, the better opportunity we have as a field to go out and champion our cause, right? To get involved in legislation and, again, not in a lobbying way, but in an information and education sharing way. And so that's what we want to do. We really want to make sure people are aware of who we are, and we want to really get more probation and parole officers interested in being and engaging in APPA, not just paying their $50 per year membership just to say I'm a member, but really to dig deep and get involved on committees, et cetera.
We really do need to be better ambassadors for ourselves, for our field, exactly, and take care of some of these misnomers and biases that folks just don't have about the role of a probation and parole officer. Say, Veronica, look into your crystal ball, embracing an infinite mindset. If and when I have you back on the show in 2 or 3 years, hop in your time machine. What do you think we might be talking about at that time?
Oh my God, how our success stories have grown exponentially. That's my prayer. That is absolutely my prayer. And I think we're on the precipice of doing something different and changing the way we've done business and being conscious of the people we serve and why they're in this space, many of them. And so that's my hope. That's my hope that we've made some major changes in that regard.
Yeah, I meant it when I said that earlier, that I think we're at a really exciting time in the field. You mentioned the various committees of APPA, and I've had some really great conversations with my friends on the technology committee, and we've talked about the fact that for better or worse, some of us at least feel that COVID really put us in a situation where we had to challenge our standard operating procedures because we weren't allowed, for example, field visits, and it made us sort of question, well, what was the value added of that? If it was simply to stand on someone's doorstep on a Saturday night and give them a breathalyzer, now you can't do that. But how else are your interventions driving that person out of a life of criminality? And now whether we can do this electronically or remotely, again, we sort of had to take a hard look at our practices and measure the effectiveness. And I think, again, from that, among other things we learned, okay, let's leverage technology. Or as you said, let's really look at our role here of helping these folks. So yeah, I think it's been sort of a perfect storm, that and all the great work that you and the folks at APPA have done, that I think big changes are on the horizon.
Yeah. Silver lining and everything. And I think we know now the sky didn't fall in when we went almost 2 years without supervision in the office. As a matter of fact, a lot of offices are saying they're making a total transition to something that looks different. Some offices are shutting down their storefront completely. Others are like, okay, a couple of days a week in the office so we can all come together and have meetings and things like that. So, yeah, and I think I was talking to a judge recently who said that one of the things for him was he thought, okay, so all of these people that I gave a requirement to get tested for drugs on a weekly or biweekly or monthly basis, and they didn't, and I'm having the parole or the probation officers report to me about what happened with those individuals during the course of the 18 months or whatever period of time. And he says, yeah, Veronica, you're right. The sky didn't fall in. And he says, and I also realized that some of the people I was requiring to get those drug tests didn't need to be drug tested because they weren't drug users. They were selling drugs. And most salesmen, kind of sort of don't use their own product, especially a salesman that's, unfortunately doing something like that. So I think it's making a lot of us think about, as you said, how we go forward and how we change and do things that I think makes more sense for not just the officer, but for the individuals on supervision as well, because that's most important. Because and then it all the net of it all is it's all about society as a whole, right?
We have an axiom in trainer world, or at least in evidence-based practice trainer world, whenever we question someone as to why they do something, and our heads always explode whenever the response is, well, we've always done it that way, Joe.
And we know the second part of that.
Yeah. Well, and again, whether it was the judge talking about why they give or order UAs rather, or a lot of the practices that we had to reevaluate during the lockdowns was, if the answer was simply, well, we've always done it that way, we owe it to our stakeholders and our clients to have a better response than that. Veronica Cunningham, American Probation and Parole Association, I am so thrilled to have gotten you on this very special edition of the Criminalogist podcast, highlighting some of the great work of APPA. I look forward to seeing you at those institutes and having you back on the show at some point in the future, Veronica. Thanks again so much.
Thank you, Joe. I really appreciate it. It's been fun. I always like having just comfortable, candid conversations about this work. Thank you.
As do I. Take care.
Thank you.
A big Criminalogist podcast thank you to Veronica Cunningham for appearing on the program this week. And a shout out to all of those at APPA who have been so very instrumental in this initiative to showcase the work of the American Probation and Parole Association on this program. If you are new to the podcast, I encourage you to go back and review some of our earlier installments. As referenced in this interview, we bring you guests from around the globe, from academia, from the field of corrections, and of course, those with lived experience. And if you are intrigued by the emerging desistance models, which we are learning more and more about, well, then this is the podcast for you. We will be back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact this show or reach out to us through our website, the Paragon Group, LLC.com, for training or presentations as to evidence-based practices, core correctional skills, program design, or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram page at The Criminalogist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. The Criminalogist Media Group is also on Twitter. Give us a follow at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminalogist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminalogist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. Merchandise is now available. Visit us at the Paragon Group, LLC.com. Search for the tab entitled Shop, and you'll find all sorts of details on how to secure your very own Criminalogist coffee mug, refrigerator magnet, or pen. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word. Tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the podcast. And of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
And one of the things I've committed to them, whether it's through APPA or me as an individual, when this war is over, several of us have committed ourselves to going to Ukraine to help them to rebuild their probation services.
This has been a special APPA edition of the Criminalogist Podcast. Their international relations team looks forward to sharing the insights of other subject matter experts from around the world in future episodes. The Criminalogist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.